So, after that last video and the really helpful comments I got on it, I think I have a lot of sensible, realistic directions for where I could take this project next. For example, it might make sense to flesh out the physical terrain, or it might make sense to start thinking ahead to economies and societies, or maybe this would be a good time to buckle down and make these grids I'm outputting fully GIS compatible. But I'm not going to do any of that. This project is about fantasy maps, and I want to think about the fantasy elements of what we're doing here early and often. So, as the second update on this project, I'm going to be roughing out how to represent magic on the map. This might seem super premature, because eventually this is going to have to fit in with a whole lot of the other systems we're building, but I really want to have magic baked in from the beginning. And I think it's cool to think about what it means to represent magic on a map. What does it mean to represent magic on a map in a fantasy setting? Obviously, in fantasy, the relationship between place and magic differs a lot from world to world. And we don't want to lock our users into a very narrow conception of fantasy magic, but also if you're using map generation software to think through your fantasy world building, you probably want it to take some stance on arcane geography. And I think novels, especially series of novels, can give us a sense of the range of options for place and magic. In the Broken Earth series, the way magic works is tied to geology and to the location of ancient obelisks, and so the potential of a location for huge destructive magic is necessarily very closely tied with the specifics of its geology. Meanwhile, in the craft sequence, some places are more magical than others for a variety of reasons. Sometimes because the volcanic caldera is the location where ancient gods live, sometimes because the pyramid was the site of sacrifices for many generations, sometimes because capitalism turned a landscape into some kind of awful, twisted, unlivable mess. And finally, in the Dead Djinn universe, places are magic because the people living in them have knowledge of how to do magical things. So, big cosmopolitan cities like Cairo and New Orleans have supernatural events because of the actions of their residents, not because of anything innate about their locations. And incidentally, this is much easier to talk about in the context of novels rather than TTRPGs, because game settings tend to keep these things relatively loose to allow adventure to happen at any time in any place. Like, the Sword Coast has plenty of opportunities for magic, but the map is relatively silent on which places are more innately magical, and that makes the geography of the setting feel a little bit more sterile. At any rate, for this project, I think we're going to do something similar to the craft sequence, where there are a whole lot of potential sources for magic. I think it makes sense to start out with this kind of maximalist approach, and then let the users adjust the sources of magic to suit the kind of map they want to build, or turn it off entirely for that matter. So what are we trying to do in this video? As a first pass, I'm going to try to talk through some prospective sources of magic. Then I'll describe how we're going to model flows of magic across the map to give us some interesting and organic shapes. And finally, I'll provide a bit of a preview of how this is going to interact with the rest of the project. And as we go through all of this, you might notice that I'm kind of putting the cart before the horse by building up these magic systems before everything else. I just thought this would be interesting to work on, but also having this roughed in before everything else, I hope will make things easier down the line. Anyway, with all that said, welcome to the second episode of Multiversal Map Room. This week, we'll be adding magic to the map and starting to talk through how the different map generation systems are going to interact. So in terms of thinking about potential sources of magic, as a generalized start, I wanted to think about prospective real world analogs. Like, we could just be totally arbitrary and say magic bubbles up from secret, hidden places of the world without any rhyme or reason, but I think when we're building a larger than life fantasy map, it's more interesting to conceive of magic as arising from awe inspiring places. And so, as a real world analogy for sources of magic, I've been doing some research on holy sites. And obviously, this analogy is not one to one. Real world religion is all about articulating rules for how the world works or ought to work, and kind of the social structures that arise out of that. Meanwhile, magic, in the modern fantasy context, is about putting rules on your story that let the characters act in larger than life, supernatural ways, but with some sense of internal logic. So, those absolutely are not the same thing. But in terms of locations that generate a sense of awe, I'd argue that real world holy sites operate on the same kind of logic as narratively satisfying sources of fantasy magic. So, by far the largest source of real world holy sites is places of incredible scenic beauty. And these make sense. They naturally invoke a source of awe, right? Lots of these are mountains or mountain ranges or other high places. Honestly, there's a whole lot of sacred mountains all over the world. But there's also lakes and rivers and islands and caves and other kinds of unique geological sites. Some of these, like mountains and islands, are going to be easy to include in the kind of map making software we're building right now. Others, I think, we'll need to revisit in another update. And closely related to this are holy sites where the map has changed within human memory. Places like volcanoes or impact craters. And again, it's easy to see why these evoke a sense of awe and why these feel kind of larger than the real world. And in a fantasy world building context, it's easy to see these being treated as magical sites as well. Many of these are beautiful. I'm breaking them out of the broader set of sites of natural beauty because they're so much more dramatic on the human scale than the features that have lasted since way before human memory. And, like, in the context of map making, if we have an impact crater, why wouldn't we be treating it as a magical site? And finally, there's the category of holy sites that people from settled agrarian religious traditions are most familiar with, namely locations where ritual events happened over and over for long periods of time until the locations themselves accrued great significance. These places have become regarded as holy because of historical events and long standing cultural practices, and many of them are sufficiently holy in the real world that I'm a little worried the algorithm will disfavor these pictures of them. So no one tell YouTube about this, yeah? Anyway, the analogy in a fantasy world building context is that some long-time settlements will just become extremely magically important, and not always for reasons we could infer from geography. So now we have all these different types of awe-inducing sites that might make sense as sources of magic. We need to translate those into our project. What does it look like to build these sources of magic into our map generation software? Uh, as we add more features, we'll have more sites that correspond to the sources of magic we'd expect. For example, in future updates, we'll definitely have impact craters and rivers and ancient settlements. For now, though, we really just have elevation and sea level. So, to get a sense of how things are going to look, we'll start with just three categories of location: high isolated mountains and high mountain ranges in general, isolated deep depressions, and small islands. We'll find all these places on the maps we've already generated, and we'll assert that some of them are sources of magic according to some, pseudo-random number generator, and see what kind of maps that gives us. Later on in this project, we can calibrate the probability that, a particularly high mountain is a source of magic so that the map has an interesting number of these sources. But for the sake of this video, we're going to err on the side of a higher probabilities just to see what kind of maps that gives us. For concreteness, here are some sample terrain maps you might recognize from last week's video. And here are some mountains and depressions and islands that our code identifies as potential magic sources. You might see that some of those mountain ranges are aerial sources of magic, that is, not just single points, and this lines up with the concept that a whole range of mountains can be an awe-inspiring, larger-than-life location. And again, we're not treating every island as a magic site, we're just picking some of them at a probability inversely proportional to their size, and then we're letting the water around those magic islands be a source of magic too, so islands show up a little fuzzy here. And obviously this doesn't include all those other sources of magic we discussed earlier, because those aren't in the code yet. This is just to get a sense of how things could eventually look. And here are those two maps superimposed. As you can see, this is kind of a mess, which is why we need to start handling this using GIS layers rather than putting everything in one image. But for now, let's just look at those magic sources again to keep things a little cleaner. And if you're looking at this, you're probably thinking, okay, that's cool, but how does this fit with the goal of larger-than-life, hyper-realistic fantasy world building? And fair enough. This doesn't look impressive, and when I think about including magic on a map, I don't just think about having hotspots like this. I want to have a whole parallel layer of spatial flows of magic, and ideally, something that looks more organic than this. So, how do we build something around these point sources that covers more of the map and gives us meaningful variation and patterns that look like they grew naturally with the landscape around them? I did mess around a bit with just putting geodesic lines between these points to get some, straight ley line type constructions, and that just looked messy and unfocused. But after a little bit of reading, I realized there was something that would build up from these isolated sources and generate the kind of flows I was envisioning. And what I ended up settling on specifically to build the kinds of organic networks of lines and channels around the discrete points of these magical sites was the kind of slime mold patterns that researchers in the 2010s used to demonstrate slime molds growing outward to transport nutrients, and how they could build networks that looked a lot like the transportation network of a city or a country or a continent if you put the nutrients down over the population centers. I've always been fascinated by this whole line of research. I think the original idea was the researchers were trying to say, look, a very basic heuristic that arises from decentralized slime molds seeking nutrients can give us a really close approximation to solving the optimal transportation problem, which is NP hard. But then pop science media love these slime molds growing over maps, and so the researchers doubled down and made a lot more maps. And fair enough, honestly, the slime molds generate some extremely cool looking patterns. And these networks, with their big channels between the important points and their softer filaments and their overall organic shapes, are the inspiration I'm going to use to model the flows of magical energy on the maps we're making. In my version, the magical sites are the nutrients, and the lines between them are currents of magical energy, or ley lines, or whatever you want to call them. And so now a few randomly placed sources on the map can give rise to a whole complex network. So how do we go from those relatively plain maps of magical intensity I showed a few minutes ago to something that has that slime mold structure grown onto it? This 2010 paper from a journal very ambitiously called Artificial Life provides a recipe that I was able to adapt. Basically, you generate a ton of tiny random rovers that crawl towards the points with the highest magical intensity. But the important wrinkle is that the tracks of those rovers themselves increase the local magic intensity. Just by a little bit, and it decays over time, so it's not overshadowing the underlying magical sources. But that increase in local magical intensity as the rovers move means that the rovers tend to converge to the same tracks. So you get these branching networks of filaments that tend to travel towards those sources of magical power as kind of growing currents. Programming this up wasn't that hard, and when we turn it on for those maps I showed previously and let the rovers run for a bunch of steps, I'm actually going to stop talking for a moment so you can see how this really simple algorithm builds up a whole network of magical energy over many iterated steps. So, honestly, I'm pretty pleased with how this is looking. We don't even have that many sources of magical energy on the map yet, but the slime mold algorithm still generates flows that have these interesting long-range spatial structures clustered around the sites that feel organic but also energetic. And once we add in the other magical sources we've been thinking about, these will be even denser. So let's superimpose this back on the terrain map for a moment. I mean, now it looks even messier, but those flows of magical energy have created new regions of heightened magic far from the point sources we identified previously. And of course, nothing here is even unique to this map in particular. We can do the same thing with a different map, generated with a different initial seed value, but all the same logic. And another, and one more with a really busy network because a lot of small islands get labeled as magical sites. And yeah, so as far as I can tell, this is a really promising start. Again, right now we're only identifying a few points as sites of magical energy, or rather, as nutrients for the slime mold, based off topography and sea level. In future iterations, once we have rivers and ruins and volcanoes and villages, we'll have a much richer network of sites, which I think will give us denser and more varied networks of magical flow. Before we wrap up, I want to discuss how this might interact with the other systems we're building as part of this project. This is going to become a recurring segment as the project grows and gets more moving parts that need to work together. Hopefully it makes sense from the preceding discussion of magical sites, but in terms of how map generation actually operates, we need to identify the sources and build the networks between them after we do, for example, terrain and settlement generation. This does limit how things work just a little bit. For example, it means that settlements influence the location of magic sites, rather than having the location of magic sites impact the location of settlements or having them co-evolve somehow. And that implies that magic is going to be a little more of an outer layer relative to fundamental underlying stuff like terrain and hydrology and biomes. But that being said, once we generate that magic layer, we'd really like to be able to use it to influence other things presented on the map. In addition to explicitly denoting places where the slime mold algorithm gives us localized areas of high magic flow, we can use this underlying magic to give settlements in high magic areas more magical flavors. Druids and dragons and dryads will be more likely in high magic locations, and maybe some other more mundane polities will only happen in particularly low magic areas, but that part I need to think through. And finally, of course, arcane points of interest like wizard towers and planar portals and mysterious glowing spires, I want to add those to the map, and those are going to be happening at high magic sites only. This is something we'll be adding way down the line, though, and of course all of this is going to look really different once we have all the additional magic sites arising from craters and volcanoes and rivers and settlements and all the other sources we discussed before. Anyway, that's all for this week. If you couldn't tell from this video, I'm really learning as I go and setting priorities week by week for what to work on next. I'd appreciate any feedback you might have on this project. Thank you for watching all the way through to the end.